So as Donald mentioned, I'm an author and I'm an entrepreneur. I've lived in Hong Kong for 19 years, and during that time I've owned and rented commercial, industrial, and residential property. I've been a landlord both here and in Japan, and I've started and I've sold businesses. I'm now writing my third book, which is about China. And as a result of that experience, I know just how frightening the real estate business can be here, especially for small businesses and for startups. So today I'm going to describe some of the property options that you have for your small business, from working at home to going to the final end of the spectrum, which is actually buying a property. And then I'll look at some of the challenges and opportunities along the way, and I'll wrap up with a comparison of the costs involved and a brief case study. So let's start with the home office. It's a great place to start a business if you're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur. It's a place where you can see if your business is viable, and it's also a place where you can see if you're cut out to be an entrepreneur, because a lot of people think that they are, but confronted with the day-to-day realities, decide they'd rather actually work for a company. If the business is not as strong as you thought it was, it's relatively easy to unwind a home office compared to having a lease or buying a place. With a laptop, with some of Herman's cloud-based services, with Wi-Fi, it's really easy to run a business from your home. And working without a conventional office is a lot more common now than it used to be. According to the Urban Land Institute, some 40% of IBM's employees now work from a location other than an IBM office. As long as you're not making a lot of noise, your landlord probably isn't going to care about you working from home. And you can use your home as your registered business office. You can also write off part of your occupancy expenses like rent and utilities. So make sure you talk to your accountant about that. But there are downsides. You might be surprised how much noise gentlemen like this make during the day while you're trying to work. Also, you've got renovating neighbors, you've got road work and things like that. And if you're a social person, you may find it actually gets a little bit lonely. Hong Kong apartments are small, so if you start hiring staff, working from home stops being a viable option. Your home is also a very rich source of distractions. A recent survey of American telecommuters found that the top distractions in order were household chores, TV, pets, errands, the internet, and kids. The chores are not such a big deal in Hong Kong because you've probably got an AMA, but everything else certainly is. You'll need discipline to actually get work done, and if you're a type A personality like I am, you may need discipline to actually stop working at the end of the day. One tip, if you are going to work from home, buy yourself a very comfortable ergonomic chair, a Herman Miller Aeron or something like that, and set your office up with proper ergonomics, with proper light, with proper ventilation. It'll make a huge difference to your comfort and also to your productivity. You can also check out sites like lifehacker.com, which have got a lot of tips for people who are commuting and working from home. With a little bit of creativity, you can really enhance your home office experience. For example, I have one friend with a software startup who actually skipped the home office entirely and ran his startup from the Hong Kong Public Library because it had free Wi-Fi, it had quiet, it had color photocopiers, and it had air conditioning being very important here in Hong Kong. Another friend is a commercial artist, and he swapped desk space for random assignments with another art company. So that was a way for him to get the on-ramp into having a fully operational business. I have an editor friend, an Australian, who sold her house in Australia and now spends her time traveling and working remotely. She runs marathons, and now she's in New York City, but she also likes to work from Istanbul and Kuching. That may be more than you want to do, but it does illustrate what is in fact possible. This won't work for a shoe factory, but I do know I do know knowledge-based companies who have rented space inside a client's office. They've had space donated to them by a sponsor that's increased in rent over time, and that's sublet grade B space from other companies. So there's lots of different opportunities there and options there. The attraction to these arrangements is that they're cheap. With a little bit of luck, you can get a very high-quality office for not a lot of money. But you'll need time and a good network to actually uncover those opportunities. The other downside to that is that those opportunities tend to be short-term. You get 6 months here, 9 months there, and the time that you spend looking for those opportunities can take away from the time that you really maybe ought to be spending doing your business. Now let's take a quick look at serviced offices. In addition to meeting rooms, they offer turnkey packages, a receptionist, basic furniture, broadband, mail services, things like that, from everything from a single person operation to a multi-person company. Some offer things like video conferencing and access to offices in other countries and other cities. And there are business incubators like Boot, a company here in Hong Kong that you may have heard of, that help startups. These serviced offices give you flexibility. You can rent them by the hour, you can rent them by the year, and a long-term commitment is usually not required. You can increase and decrease your space to fit changing circumstances as well. And they range from quite luxurious in places like IFC to very, very modest and more Spartan in some of the outlying areas. But serviced offices are a little bit like hotel minibars. In that they sell you convenience for a price. If you actually go and rent an office, the cost per day of occupancy is generally a lot less. You want to think carefully too about why you're using a serviced office. If your goal is to escape the distractions at home, you probably don't need a place in IFC2 that's all very glitzy, because that's going to be more expensive. If on the other hand you're doing a lot of client meetings and presentations, then you are going to need a little bit more flash. And also, some people need quiet. That's the thing that they're looking for, is a quiet, undisturbed working environment, whereas other people are looking to interact with other entrepreneurs, where you get a buzz, where you've got some things going on around you. So you want to make sure that the environment of the serviced office really fits your needs. Security is also an important consideration with the serviced office, and that's particularly true if you're developing intellectual property, if you've got expensive equipment around, or if you're doing client confidential work. So it's a good idea to ask about the serviced office's security and access control systems. And if you need to work on weekends, make a point of asking about whether or not you can get 24-hour access and whether or not air conditioning is included. Because if you're working in a building with central aircon on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of August, it's not a lot of fun. Renting an office makes sense when you know that your company is viable and you know how much space that you're going to need. It gives you a sense of permanence and a real company feel that you're not going to get from a home office or a serviced office. But it also adds complications, and it also adds some costs. Typically, you're going to pay the landlord the first month's rent and a 2-month deposit, and you're going to pay half of the stamp duty charges, which on a 2-year lease amounts to about 0.5% of the annual rent. Don't forget, you're also going to give the agent half a month's rent for brokering a deal. Finding a competent real estate agent is absolutely essential. The major agencies, people like Centerline, Midland, and Rika Corp, as well as smaller people like CharterSense, have got operations that specialize in serving small businesses, and they're happy to help you with that. The agents typically concentrate on specific neighborhoods. That's how their knowledge is organized. And their skill level and also their language abilities vary quite greatly. Personal referrals are an excellent way of finding a competent agent. You can also help yourself by doing a lot of research beforehand. So that means knowing what neighborhood you want to be in, knowing how much money you want to spend, knowing what's essential and what's negotiable. Having all that figured out before you start the conversation with an agent and before you start looking is going to save you and the agent time ultimately. Typical lease here in Hong Kong is 2 years long. You may be able to negotiate a break lease clause, which allows you to give the owner 2 months' notice and vacate after a year. So that means you effectively have a 14-month-long minimum tenancy period. Many leases here in Hong Kong contain a clause that prohibit you from subletting the office should you decide that you want to get out. So watch out for that. And some include a clause that gives the landlord the right to terminate the lease unilaterally. So again, watch out for that. That can be a major pain if you spent a lot of money making your office look really good and the landlord comes in and says, you got 2 months and you're out. Your lease can include or exclude rates, government rent, and management fees. So if you're not familiar with those terms, rates are a quarterly property tax. And recently the government has been waiving that charge, so it may be to your advantage to exclude that from your lease, so that if the government continues to waive that charge, you get the benefit from that. Government rent is a small charge that the government levies for the use of the land underneath the building, and management fees, of course, are the monthly charge that pays for maintenance of common areas and things like air conditioning and lifts and lobbies and such. The lease that's shown here is a very standard lease, and it can be purchased from stationery stores. It's bilingual, and it's very, very commonly used by small landlords. Ordinarily, I wouldn't recommend that you go with a piece of boilerplate like this, but this can be a very good starting point because it's bland, and you can add a rider to it to include things like break lease clauses and also any furniture or fittings that are there. The nice thing about that standard lease too is that there are no nasty surprises in there. And if you are signing a lease and somebody gives you a 30-page stack of paper, it's very easy for them, if it's somebody who's not really ethical, to slip in something complicated. And most of us, we start to read that 30-page lease and sort of our attention wanders as we get through it. So that basic lease has actually got a place. Hong Kong property is sold and rented on a gross floor area basis, and depending on the building, your efficiency ratio, and that's the ratio of usable space to gross space, can range from as high as 90% to as low as 60%. And that is taken up by things like lift lobbies, by utility shelves and things like that. You're paying for all that, so it's worth paying attention to. Management fees also are based on your gross floor area. Building management here in Hong Kong is variable. Grade A buildings like IFC2 here or Exchange Square are usually extremely well managed. Grade B and Grade C buildings, where most small and medium-sized businesses end up, are a much more different thing. They can be hit and miss. I had one building in Graham Street in Central where if you went in there on a Sunday, it was not unusual to find the security guard asleep on a cot in the hallway. Not good for client meetings, obviously. A word about building grades, and you've probably heard this thrown around a lot, grade A, grade B, grade C. Well, what do they mean? Grade A buildings have central air conditioning, they've got large floor plates, they've got parking lots, lots of lifts, and typically nice lobbies. Grade B might have central air conditioning, it might have parking, generally has a less glamorous lobby, and Grade C generally doesn't have parking, doesn't have central air conditioning, and it probably only has one elevator, and that does double duty for people as well as for goods. It's also worth noting that the location has nothing to do with whether a building is grade A, B, or C. You can have a grade A building in a place like Tsuen Wan, like Nina Towers, and you can have grade C buildings right in the heart of Central. Before you sign anything, check the cleanliness of shared facilities like lobbies, elevators, and toilets. I also recommend that you'll have a look at the stairwells and fire escapes, which should be free of debris, just in case you ever have to vacate in a hurry. And it's also a good idea to check the building outside of regular office hours to see how it's managed and to see what other tenants are up to. It's not unusual, particularly in places like Causeway Bay, to discover that somebody has set up a private kitchen in some of these buildings, or even a private club. You'll also need to decide whether or not you want to rent an office that is fitted or bare shell, or something in between. And if it's bare shell, like this one here, you can usually negotiate a rent-free period while you're actually decorating. You may need to install a lot of stuff, ranging from air conditioning to electrical wiring, phone and data lines, carpet ceiling, window coverings, and internal partitions. If you're going to go down this route, it is a good idea to pay close attention to the lease terms, because you may very well be expected to return it to the landlord in exactly that condition. So you'll have the budget for having somebody to come in and remove all of your improvements. You'll also want to consider the time that you need to hire and manage a designer and a contractor. Finding a competent builder, especially one who's registered under the new minor works control scheme, can be tough, especially when the economy is booming. If a builder is good in Hong Kong, very often they've got more work than they know what to do with. And they really have their pick of clients. In some buildings, you've got to use something called a nominated contractor, which is a real scam. A nominated contractor is basically got a lock on all of the renovations that take place in that building, and that nominated contractor generally charges a lot for his services or her services, and they don't really have a lot of incentives to keep you happy. So keep an eye out for that one. Some renovations need the approval of the building's owners committee and also the buildings department. Whatever you do, don't cut corners on getting those approvals, particularly with the buildings department. The buildings department in the last couple of years has been getting quite strict, and they can make you come in and remove improvements that you've made, even if they're perfectly safe, if everything is just so, specifically because you haven't gotten approval beforehand. So that's worth keeping an eye out for. Also, try and avoid making changes to fire sprinkler systems like the one you can see in the roof here. The people who take care of fire sprinklers in Hong Kong are like an ancient guild. There's a very, very few of them out there, and they charge a lot of money for their services. Dropping or taking a couple of inches off a fire sprinkler can easily cost you $1,000, and that's money you could spend better on nice carpets and other things like that. In light of the above, a fitted office might actually be a cheaper solution. In addition to decorations, you're going to need to choose between central and individual air conditioning. And as I mentioned a moment ago, with central aircon, you get aircon during office hours. So usually that's from 8:30 in the morning till 6:30 at night and 8:30 to 1:30 on Saturday. And with central aircon, you get the basic ducting and the fan coils, like what you can see in the ceiling here. If you got to work on Saturday afternoons and Sundays, you can expect to pay probably about $300 an hour if you want air conditioning during that period, and there's usually a 2 or 3 hour minimum charge. So if you do spend a lot of time working outside of normal office hours, that's something that may be a deal breaker for you. In some buildings, you can install split-type air cons that let you cool at will. And what I discovered the hard way is that figuring out what size air conditioner to put in there is surprisingly complicated. You would think it would be fairly simple, but it's not. So get professional advice, because if you get too small an air conditioner, you're never going to be comfortable in the height of summer. And if you get too much, you're going to be basically wasting money, and it's not going to be operating efficiently. Compressors for split-type air conditioners are normally mounted on the outside of the building, as you can see here. It's essential, if you're going to get these installed, that you get competent help to do it. I also tend to insist on seeing proof of insurance if anybody's hanging something like that on the outside of the building. Falling equipment can result in deaths, criminal charges, civil lawsuits, property damage, and a host of other nasty things. And there are people out there who do this without proper insurance. The reality is, if you hire somebody like that, they're probably a low-buck contractor, and they probably don't have any assets. So if something bad does happen, the first reaction will be for the victim to go after the contractor. When they discover the contractor has no money, they're going to come after you. So you don't want to go there. It's not a happy place. Another important choice is between a large corporate landlord and a small one, who's often an individual investor. Both have advantages and disadvantages. However, landlords remain as unpopular today as they did back in the 1880s. Large landlords generally are stable and they're impersonal. They ask for a lot of things that I personally disagree with, like personal guarantees, 3 months deposit, unilateral break lease clauses, restoration fees, and so on. They also have a habit of wasting your time making you deal with minions, which I also find kind of objectionable. Small landlords, on the other hand, are more likely to negotiate with you to avoid a vacancy. So they tend to be a bit more flexible in terms of price, especially if you can connect with them on a personal level. They also have the advantage of being able to make fast decisions, whereas with a large commercial landlord, they've got to send it up to get a manager's approval. Your rent means a lot more to a small landlord than it does to a large corporation. They tend to take it very personally if you pay late, whereas if you're talking with one of Li Ka-shing's companies, they'll just sick a lawyer on you when the time comes. Small landlords can also be quirky, though. One of the landlords that I had in a flat that I rented nearly electrocuted herself trying to replace a light switch because she couldn't spring for an electrician to do it. Another one, we came home from a vacation and discovered that the landlord had replaced the faucet in our nice pink bathtub with a shiny black tap, which was sort of a fashion crime. Small landlords are also more likely to sell the unit out from under you than large landlords are. Now, if that happens, don't panic. The new landlord will take over all of the obligations of the previous landlord, including paying you your deposit back when the lease is up. Buying is the final rung on the ladder. It's a big commitment, but it lets you lock in your occupancy costs and also insulates you from rental increases and the whims of landlords. It can, and can being the operative phrase, also be a good investment. Unlike many places, Hong Kong has a mature, transparent property market. Legal protection is really good here. You don't have to be Chinese to buy, and you don't have to be a resident to buy either. Matter of fact, you don't have to speak Chinese, and that's worth mentioning. Hong Kong has got a lot of grade B and grade C offices where you can buy individual offices as well as whole floors if you're inclined to do that. The grade A buildings like this one, for example, are typically owned by a single owner, so it's hard to buy space in a grade A building. Not impossible, but hard. Offices can be sold and bought with or without a tenant, and mortgages up until recently have been fairly easy to get. It's getting a little bit harder now. Everything that I mentioned earlier about the difference between a bare shell and a fitted office applies equally and investigating building management also applies to an office that you're going to buy. The offices are actually more important if you're a buyer, because if you buy in a building and discover that you don't like the neighborhood, you don't like the neighbors, you don't like the building, unwinding it is a lot harder and a lot more expensive. As an owner, you're also liable for the cost of repairs and improvements, so you want to pay very close attention, especially in an older grade B and grade C building, to things like roofs, common areas, and lifts. Lifts can get quite expensive to fix and to replace. If you buy, you're going to pay 1% of the purchase price as an agent's commission, and you'll also pay stamp duty. For an office priced between 4.4 million Hong Kong dollars and $6 million, the rate of stamp duty is 3%. You'll also need to budget for legal fees, and for a cash purchase of a typical small office, that runs around 10,000 Hong Kong dollars. If you've got a mortgage, it goes up because the paperwork becomes more complex. Offices in older buildings generally sell for less than those in newer ones. The newer ones tend to require less maintenance and also tend to be more energy efficient, so it saves you on running costs. Other factors that affect cost are the proximity to Central, because this is really the hub for Hong Kong, and also proximity to the mass transit railway station, the nearest station, and finally sea views are obviously very important here. You can find asking and actual sales prices from the website of Hong Kong's large real estate agencies, and you can also get historical data from the Hong Kong government's land registry. So, what does all of this cost? Well, here's some indicative data, all fairly recent, all in Hong Kong dollars and all from Hong Kong Island. A home office can actually have negative cost. If you're already paying for rent and you've got some extra space, it can actually save you money because you can write off some of your occupancy costs against the rent that you're paying already. A basic 90 square foot room in a serviced office is going to run you about $4,000 a month, including rent, internet, and a receptionist. $4,000 a month doesn't buy you much. That's fairly modest, and that will be somewhere like Sheung Wan or Sai Ying Pun or maybe Quarry Bay. It won't be a place that you're going to be bringing a lot of tenants to. You can buy a grade B office for about $6,500 a square foot, so the cost for a 700 square foot office is going to be plus or minus about 4.5 million Hong Kong dollars. The monthly management fee for that is roughly about $2.75 to $3 a square foot, just again for orders of magnitude. In 2002, I bought a grade C building, and this is the one I mentioned earlier, a floor in a grade C building in Graham Street here in Central. It was 1,000 square feet, and here's what it looked like before the rehab. The unit had actually been abandoned by its previous owner. There was no locks on the doors, the windows had been left open. And if you look in the bottom corner there, you can see a wet spot. That's where the fire hose had been dripping into the jute carpet for a couple of months. It stank to high heaven. But it had a great location. It was just next to the wet market. And the price was right. I paid 20 cents on the dollar from the previous owner. It was a big job to do the renovation. Over 6 weeks, we installed new electrical systems, lights, carpet, doors, and built-in storage. So it looks a little bit different then than it did when we started. So to give you an idea, too, of what that cost, and this is a couple of years old now, but just, again, orders of magnitude. That was $1 million. You're not going to buy much for $1 million these days, unfortunately. The agent fee actually came down a little bit because we bought during a downturn and we could negotiate with the agent. Stamp duty has changed a little bit. The government has recently rejigged that. Hiring a designer was actually a good investment. The designer came by with things like furniture samples and carpet samples. It saved us schlepping around through the bowels of Wan Chai, which actually can be a lot of fun, but if you're trying to renovate an office while you're working, it can be quite time consuming. The contractor basically took care of everything, including a new master circuit board. We put in a few extra pieces of furniture, and again, managed to negotiate the legal fees down because the market was a little bit soft at that point. So that brings me very close to the end of the presentation. If you are thinking about taking the plunge to buy, I'd just like to mention 3 things that you should keep in mind. One is that Hong Kong's property market is volatile. If you lived here during the Asian financial crisis, 1997, some sections of the property market here dropped basically 2/3 overnight. And that's a pretty scary thing to have happen to you. Second, it's a very sentiment-driven market. if the mood of Hong Kong changes, everybody can go from being maximum bullish on property to being very, very negative just in the flick of a finger. So you want to be prepared for that. And third, it's cyclical. If you look at Hong Kong's property market, it does go in very broad cycles. So if you are thinking of buying, keep an eye out for one of those downturns. It can always drop a little bit further, but if you're buying near or at the bottom of the cycle, that's very often where money is made. So that brings me now to the most important part of the presentation, which is your questions.